Welcome to our weekly Church on the Rock podcast. For more information, visit us at churchak.org, download our Church on the Rock AK app, or like us on our Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy our weekly podcast.
What I want to do today is address some perspectives that shape the ways we actually act or don't act. I turned 49 this February, and you know what comes after 49? Dead. No. Listen, I am not excited about getting older. In some ways I am. In fact, in ministry, I've actually been most excited about my 50s for a really long time. In almost every other area of life, not so much. Getting old is hard. How many old people do we have in here? Okay, how many of you are young but you just feel old? Yeah. So I was at the doctor about 8 months ago now and discovered that I have an aneurysm, which sounds terrifying and was to me. It's in my ascending aorta, and it's like this dilation that's twice the normal size, blah, blah, blah. And all I heard them saying was, your quality of your life has completely diminished, and you might as well just go home and lay down and die. Like, they're telling me things like you shouldn't free dive anymore, you shouldn't mountain climb, you shouldn't eat, you shouldn't sleep. Seriously, so for 8 months, I was like, what am I supposed to do? Because I had this hike coming up with Wampa down in the Tetons. In fact, I just got back from it. This is my first week back home after the hike. Dave Burns, who's right here with us, was there. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to go. In fact, I couldn't do all of the exercise stuff they had scheduled for us because I didn't know if my heart was just like going to blow up. And so I'm waiting all of this time, and I finally get the all go from the doctor, or at least my interpretation of the all go. He said, you're not going to die today. And so I thought, well, that means I can go climb 2 11,000 plus peaks and travel 31 miles in 2 days on foot, which is exactly what we went and did. Now, here's the problem. I hate not being able to do things physically that I know I should be able to do. And I hate equally as much other people being able to do them when I can't seem to. That's the worst. Now, I went down to the Tetons with this idea of, hey, we live in Alaska, this is what we do, it's going to be just fine. Now, here's the downside. They gave us the t-shirt the day before we left. So I already had the t-shirt, which meant if I don't ascend both peaks in the peak to peak challenge, I can never wear the t-shirt. Or I have to scratch out this peak and put home. And peak to home doesn't sound near as amazing, right? So I had this conflict already going on in my head. I had made a promise to my wife, who's sitting right here, that if I did not feel right, if things didn't seem right, then I wasn't going to keep going. Now, we have two totally different interpretations of what that means. What I meant was, if I'm not dead, I'll keep going. What she heard was, if anything's wrong at all, if you're having trouble breathing at all, you quit. Day one, no problem. 11,300 feet, I think is what it was. Day two, on the other hand, day two, we take off, and I get about 1,000 feet up, and I don't feel right. And so I sit down on the side of the trail, and the worst thing in the world that can happen to a competitive person is watching everybody pass you. Even the old fat guys from the inner city churches were passing me. And as I'm sitting there contemplating my life, wondering if I should keep going or if I should stop, wondering how did Kitri hear the promise I made to her? Did she interpret it the way I interpreted it? As I'm sitting there, Wampa comes along. Now, Wampa could have been at the front of the pack easily, but he's keeping everybody corralled. And he sees me sitting there on the side of the trail, and he immediately knows, oh, either Jonathan's dead or he's dying, because he would not be sitting here. And so he sits down beside me, asks me how I'm doing. I tell him how I'm doing, but I think I'm going to be okay. I just need to sit and rest for a little bit, to which he says, well, I'm not leaving you until you're okay. What? So after much coercion, arm twisting, and convincing him that I won't do anything stupid, I promise, he finally decides to go and join the rest of the group. I discover later that he was okay joining the rest of the group because he knew that coming up behind him was my good friend Dave Burns. And Dave knows about my situation as well, and so he comes up after having run someone who couldn't make it all the way down the mountain, and then coming back up to me and catching up with the group, and he sees me sitting there, and he sits down. I'm like, leave me alone. I'm fine. Hey, listen, and this is what they both said to me. Listen, the greatest thing in the world is not getting to the top of this mountain. The greatest thing in the world is getting home. That's right. One time in all my preaching career that I get an amen. Greatest thing would be getting home to your family. There'll be lots of peaks to climb. And here's what they both say to me, right? If you need to go back down, I'll go down with you. I could come do this later, or I may never get to do this, but these are the priorities. This is the perspective you should have, even when my own perspective gets off. Here's what you and I need. We need people in our lives who will draw us back into focus over and over and over again. We need to be surrounded by the people who help us have the right perspective. And speaking of the right perspective, sighted in and shooting straight, I don't know if you know this, but summer's over. You can live in denial for a little bit longer, but the termination dust is on its way down. It's getting chilly at night. You should bring your plants in. I mean, it's over. In fact, it was over like 2 months ago. But still, being down in Idaho and Wyoming and coming back from someplace where it actually still is summer, and then coming back here, it is abundantly clear to me that there's only one upshot to summer being over in Alaska. You know what it is: moose season. That's right. And every year, as moose season comes around, I go out with a group of friends and we get our guns sighted in. In fact, I got a couple of pictures here of us sighting in the guns, and we went out this last year, 2020, got the guns sighted in, and I had gotten a new scope, one with the super sweet turrets on it that don't have the little covers, so that in the field, in real time, you can make your adjustments that you need to for elevation and windage and all of those kinds of things. And so I got it all dialed in, and then I took this picture of my scope so that when the moment came, I could double check and make sure that everything was dialed in just right. So we're out moose hunting in an undisclosed location that I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you. And as we're hunting there, the moment arrives, as it often does in hunting, where, boom, there's a moose in front of you. This year, instead of being 5 miles away from camp up on the top of a mountain, this year it happened right across the river from camp. I heard my son say, "There's a mouse, there's a mouse." So myself, David Pepper, Wampa, all dash over to the riverbank, level our guns across the river, and look. My son hasn't any bull tags, so all we got to see are antlers. We see antlers, and we open fire. Caleb gets to take the first shot. I take 27 shots after that. David Pepper takes 32. Wampa's just shooting in random places. It's so chaotic. And then Colton Pepper comes stumbling out of the tent, because he had been asleep until like the 37th shot. He comes stumbling out, gets the spotting scope set up, looks across the river, and he says this: "There's another bull." I too haven't any bull tag this year. And so we open fire again. What are the odds? 2 bulls on the same trail right across the river. We get down, get in the raft, paddle across the river with all kinds of excitement and a lot of work in front of us for the evening. And we get over there and discover, lo and behold, we did shoot twice at the same moose. He had gone down, gotten back up, and by the time Colton looked and we had quit looking, he says, there's another one, and we blasted the thing. There's no meat left at this point, right? Like, I got a little bit of neck meat for burger, and that's it. We blast. Now, here's why I tell you this story. I thought my gun was sighted in, and I wanted you to hear it from me instead of from someone else. Apparently, I shot the moose in the ankle. The back ankle. Like, not even up front, like in the back. At least this is what David Pepper tells me. And Colton's like, oh, I saw it through the spotting scope. I'm like, you were asleep. You had eye boogers. You don't know what you're talking about. Like, no, I saw it. So I went back and I looked at my scope and then compared it to this picture. And what I had not taken into account is for all the conveniences and the coolness of not having little covers on those turrets, as you're hiking through the brush and beating your gun against trees on the way, those things turn. Sometimes a lot. And where I thought I was aiming was not at all where I was aiming. Because sometimes it's easy as life comes your way with all the information we're bombarded with to get your sights off, to get wrapped around the axle about the wrong things. Listen, if you're paying attention to the news, any side of the aisle, if you're listening and watching in social media, it's easy to really get your tractor cranked about stuff. That's a good Oklahoma saying. Right? It's easy to get off focus, off target. And our preconceptions may cause us to see things differently than they actually are. Our preconceptions may cause us to see things differently than they actually are. Maybe you saw this picture on the internet recently. It's just an upside-down photograph of Adele. It looks interesting, but when you look at it, you're like, yes, I know who that is, and that's a normal picture just turned upside down. But if you flip it over, you discover that it is not at all. That's creepy right there. It's the exact same picture. I have them side by side. All I did was just flip the picture over and put them both there. But your mind tells you, based on what you're used to perceiving, because you're not used to seeing the picture in a format like the upside down, and you completely miss what's really there. We can take that away. It's creeping me out. I want to tell you a story today, and it may sound familiar to you, but I want to tell it in a story form, and I'm going to start in chapter 1 of the story. Chapter 1 is Mistakes Were Made. January was quickly approaching, and fear of a new administration was growing all around them. In fact, the tension was palpable in the air. Every news report was fomenting with fear. It didn't matter where you listened or where you watched, fear was the language of the day. And the prophets were promising victory to them, and the preachers were taking their positions on the stage. It had been a hard-fought and a messy campaign, but the verdict was finally in. They had lost, and their opponents had won. And now that moment had come and gone, and the finger pointing and the blame had started, and there was plenty of blame to go around because mistakes had been made. But what they all knew for certain was that power had been lost, and there would be hell to pay for it, literally. Their whole world was going to change. Their kids were going to be re-educated. Their taxes were going to be used for evil purposes. Their borders were no longer secure, and their religious freedoms were being taken away by the days. Sound familiar yet? It may sound recent, but it's not a recent story at all. It's actually an ancient story that I'm telling you. It's not just an ancient story, it's actually an ancient and recurring story throughout history. In fact, verbatim, regardless of how maybe you just heard it, what I told you is the story of Judah being taken captive by Babylon. Listen to the story in chapter 2 of History in the Making. There was a young king, his name was Josiah, and when I say young, he was young. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. Any 8-year-olds in the room? Anybody who acts like an 8-year-old? Okay, I see the finger pointing. Josiah became king at 8 years old. When Josiah was 16 years old, they discovered God's law. It had been lost, buried, hidden. They found it. Josiah has the book of the law read to him, and as he hears the law of God, his heart is broken. We're told he begins to weep. He tears his clothing because he immediately recognized we have been living in a way that is offensive to the sovereign God of all the universe. And now that he has God's law in front of him again, this 16-year-old boy who is a king begins a campaign, a 23-year-long campaign of eradicating all of the evil from the land, of doing what is right in the sight of God, of trying to bring righteousness to the nation of Judah, trying to reestablish God's kingdom. But as is often the story in the scriptures, the moment he dies, the following kings revert back to their old ways. And God has declared judgment is coming on the nation of Judah. In fact, in 605, King Nebuchadnezzar comes to take control of Jerusalem. When he shows up, there's a king in place named Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim is a weak king. In fact, when Nebuchadnezzar shows up, they give up rather easily, and they begin to pay tribute to the kingdom of Babylon. At this point, we believe that he took some of the nobles and officials captive and brought them into exile in Babylon, but the majority of the people remained in Jerusalem at this time, and they began to pay tribute to Babylon. They were a vassal kingdom now. But after about 4 years, Jehoiakim had had enough of that, and he is all done paying tribute to Babylon, and he establishes a relationship with Egypt and begins an alliance with them. When Nebuchadnezzar hears about this, he is furious. He returns and conquers both Egypt and Jerusalem, and this time he is going to take captives. This is the second deportation, the second siege. It's in March of 597 BC, and Nebuchadnezzar destroys the city, breaks down the walls, and takes captives back to Babylon. Judah isn't done. The Israelites are a stubborn people. And so they plan a coup against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar hears about the coup that they're planning and comes back again and attacks, this time completely destroying the temple. They have decimated the city of Jerusalem. They have taken the majority of the people back to Babylon. They are re-educating their children. They're changing their names to the names of their gods. They are doing all kinds of things you don't want to even imagine to them. And they have been carried off into exile. They attempt one more coup against Babylon, and he rains down all fire on them. What do when you've fought the good fight, but it seems that you've already lost the war? What do you do when you feel like you've put all of your effort forward, you tried to fight for the right things, and yet it seems like you've lost the war? Which brings me to chapter 3 in our story, lessons from the losers. Because the losers have something to teach us. Lesson number 1 is this: God never loses. Even when we do. God never loses. It's one of the things that really frustrates me so much about much of the prophetic movement is the way things are described when they don't go the way that we thought they were going to go, is that we somehow believe that God didn't have the power or you didn't do your part and he was dependent on you somehow. But the reality is, and the lesson that we're going to discover in the nation of Israel, and what I want you to be reminded of today in terms of perspective, is that God never loses, even when we've lost. Listen to how it's described in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the book, so that you don't miss it right out of the gate. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him. I'll reread that. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. God never loses. In fact, later Nebuchadnezzar is going to discover this same lesson because God's actually trying to do something not only in and for the nation of Judah, for the people, but he's also doing something for the nation of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. And through some extraordinary events that we'll look at in a moment, God introduces himself to King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar gets a glimpse of who God is, but then there is still this pride and this arrogance in his heart. And at one moment in particular, he's standing out on his balcony looking over the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and looking over all of his kingdom and everything that he's conquered. Remember, Egypt's included in that. This is a powerful nation. And he's looking out over all of it, and he says, look at this great kingdom that I have established. And a voice comes from heaven and says this, you are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. Think about the world you're living in right now. Think about what's happening around the world and then apply this truth to it. Amen. In fact, in Acts 17, Paul is up on a hill called Mars Hill, and he's gathered together with the philosophers, the thinkers, the brilliant minds of the day. These would be the Platos and the Aristotles and the Socrates, and they are up there on the mountain, the Epicurean philosophers, and they're talking about what is life all about and how does life work and what is the meaning of life, and they've got idols set up everywhere to all of the gods they can think of, but they have one, just in case they miss some, the idol to the unknown God. And Paul takes this moment to say, hey, by the way, I know who this one is. Let me tell you about him. Listen to Paul's description of God in Acts 17. He is the God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From one man, he created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, although he isn't actually far from any of us. Let me tell you about this God. He's the one who established the nations of the earth. He created them all actually from one man. And before the foundations of the world were ever laid, he determined the rise and fall of every single nation. And he has a purpose and a plan in that working that he is trying to establish. And it's this, that through those processes, he could offer the opportunity to everyone to find him. But don't be mistaken. He doesn't need anything. He is sovereign and in control. He rules in the kingdoms of men and sets over them whomever he pleases. So if the question isn't how did God lose? Then the question must be, how do we succeed in the midst of what he's doing? How do we thrive in Babylon? Which brings me to lesson 2 from the losers. If lesson 1 is God never loses, lesson 2 is this: God is always leading. He's always giving direction and clarity. God is always leading even when we're lost. In the book of Daniel, you're given this glimpse into the lives of really 4 individuals. But you could also count King Nebuchadnezzar and King Darius and King Cyrus. But it's really a glimpse into the life of just a few people, and it's an extraordinary glimpse into their lives. I don't know about you, but it would be really, really nice to have those sorts of encounters with God. Anybody? Wouldn't you love to be able to hear from God and to interpret dreams and visions for the rulers of nations and then be made the second in command? Or to be able to walk out of the fiery furnace, or to be able to walk out of the den of lions? Wouldn't you love to have some of those experiences? Anybody? What are you, like a bunch of boring schleprocks? Come on, that would just be awesome to be able to join in. But this is just a handful of the individuals in the nation. And here's what you need to know about their stories. Their stories don't begin with the miracle. They begin in the middle of a mess. Their stories don't actually begin with the supernatural. They actually begin with the suffering that they're experiencing. They don't begin with lightning from heaven. They begin with a loss to an enemy. That's where their stories actually begin. But more importantly, they're only the stories of a few. God actually has something to say to everyone who has been taken into exile, into Babylon. Because you know that it's possible to lose the power and yet maintain your position. It's possible to not have all of the authority and maintain your position. It all depends on what you're willing to sacrifice. For Daniel, for Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, they're willing to sacrifice their very lives in order to maintain their integrity, to maintain their position before God. In fact, listen to it in Daniel chapter 3, verse 14 through 18. And I am praying like mad for a generation like these 3 to be raised up. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, after they refused to bow to his idol, which most likely was an exact replica of the vision that he had with the statue, except for this one isn't made out of a bunch of different kinds of metal. It's all the metal that represented him, gold. But he builds this statue after having this encounter with God and commands everyone to bow down to it. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue from my power? Rakshak and Benny replied, you've seen VeggieTales. O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, then God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, period, Your Majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to Your Majesty that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Listen, Neb, not Eliezer, but Nebuchadnezzar. Listen, Nebuchadnezzar, you can do whatever you'd like. Here's what we know for a fact. Our God is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we want to be abundantly clear about this. There's a line we don't cross. We will not bow down to your gods. Wouldn't it be nice to have that kind of confidence? And then the miracle that comes after. I mean, you walk out of the fiery furnace without a hair singed. But remember, these are only the stories of a select few, not the story of the multitudes. Here's God's instruction to everyone who has been taken captive in Babylon. Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7. Jeremiah the prophet speaking, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, who did not rescue you from being taken into exile, but permitted it. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Here's what you need to do in Babylon. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you may have many grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. Listen, it's easy to get bent out of shape about all kinds of the wrong things, and yet no matter what situation we find ourselves in, God is saying, do not quit being the people of God. That in any kingdom, there is a kingdom that has been established and is growing and is increasing. It's the extraordinary thing about the nation of Israel. They could be dispersed all over the planet, and you would think that their cultural identity would have been completely demolished over hundreds of years, and yet in a moment when their nation is reestablished and they come back together, they have maintained their identity as the people of God, even when they've been separated from one another. He's saying, listen, wherever you find yourself, anywhere, anytime, keep building, keep planting, keep marrying, keep reproducing. Pray for the blessing of the place that you find yourself in. Work for its prosperity and tie your own future to its future blessing in me. It is possible to lose all of the power and still persevere in our purpose. And you need to know that. I need to know that. Our children need to know that. Now listen, I'm not promoting a fatalist perspective, but I am asking this question. How do I practically make a difference in the place I actually live? What am I to do here and now? Because I could spend all of my time worrying and in fear about the future, and yet I actually get to live now. You've probably heard me say this before. There are people who live in the past, the good old days before I was 50. There's the people who live in the future. One day I'm going to, I can, I might. But the only moment we actually get to live is this one. And we need to be reminded of that. What do I do now? Which brings me to lesson number 3. Not only does God never lose, and he's always leading, but God's actually called us to faith and not to fear. I want to ask you a challenging question. If you were to sit down with your children or those who know you well and you were to ask them, what do you believe about the security and the power of God's kingdom? Are you afraid that God is somehow losing because we seem to have somehow lost? Do they believe that as America goes, so Christianity goes? That as America goes, so missions in the world goes? That as America goes, so God's church goes? Are those things somehow intertwined for them? Do they believe that God's kingdom is somehow dependent on our nation? Listen, I always have to say this because, well, people love to hear what you're not saying. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we don't have responsibility in the democracy that we actually find ourselves living in. We need Christians to run for office. We need Christians to vote for righteousness. We need to picket and pass legislation. And we must ask the question, what responsibility do we have in the democracy in which we live? Listen, the moment may come. The moment may come that I must directly disobey an order of my government. That moment came for Daniel and for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. That moment came for them. That moment's come for thousands and thousands of Christians throughout human history. That moment may come for me when they say, listen, you have to marry these people. You have to teach these things to your children. You must hire these people. And in those moments, what I will do is I will use every legal, political, and personal resource I have to fight against those things. And if I no longer have access to any of those, then I must be willing to lay down my life for what is right. That moment may come, and that decision's already been made for me. There are things worth fighting for. There are things worth defending. But do not confuse national politics with God's eternal power. And do not raise a generation of powerless, politically hungry prophets. I'll never apologize for saying this. God's kingdom is not dependent on our democracy. I want my kids to fight for the right things. I want them to vote for the right things. I want my kids to get involved in politics. If I wasn't doing this, I would probably find a career in politics. That's what I would do because I think it actually matters. But I never want my children to grow up believing that God's kingdom is dependent on my democracy because He's been at work long before we ever showed up on the scene. He rules in the kingdoms of men, and He gives them to whomever He pleases. He is the sovereign God of all the universe, and He never loses. He's never lost. And He is always leading us to faith, not fear. Which brings me to chapter 4 of this great story, From the Ashes of Defeat. Consider the fact that God's purposes may not be confined to our own plans and our own processes. Because here's the reality, God's purposes cannot be thwarted. They will be accomplished. So God's purposes may not be confined to our plans or our processes. And what we discover in the book of Daniel is that God's up to something much, 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 much bigger than Judah ever could have dreamed. In fact, in the middle of their mess, God's kingdom is actually growing. There's a coup going on right in Babylon, and Babylon doesn't even know it. Nebuchadnezzar's had a few disturbing dreams, and through those dreams, he's had an encounter with God. And then through the fiery furnace, he has an encounter with God. And then this moment comes where through his pride, he experiences the consequences, and he goes out of his mind. He's insane. In fact, the text describes him as walking around in the field on all fours. His fingernails have grown long. His hair has grown long on his face and on his head. He's filthy. No one can get near him, and he's eating grass. Like, you think we got it bad with our president. Sorry. Listen, Nebuchadnezzar has lost his mind. And listen to what happens. This is his description, the letter he wrote to the entire kingdom, including Egypt, Judah, every place that Babylon is ruling. Here's the letter that Nebuchadnezzar writes. I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. His rule is an everlasting rule, and his kingdom is eternal. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, "What do you mean by doing these things?" Just pause there for a moment. You hear what he's declaring. No one can stop him. He does as he pleases, and no one can say to him, "What do you mean by doing these things?" When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. In other words, when I saw things as they actually were, that's what he means by sanity. When I lifted up my eyes and acknowledged who God actually was, everything was restored to me. When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom with even greater honor than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. You tell me which is better, that Judah repents and acknowledges God, and that the temple in Jerusalem remains intact, or that the entire kingdom that Babylon rules acknowledges and recognizes the sovereign God of all the universe. We need a generation that is full of faith for the season they find themselves in. They are not living in fear of what might be or could be, and they're not longing for what they think should be. They trust the sovereign God of all the universe. We do our part right here and right now, and at the end of the day, when the decision is made, we believe there is a God who is at work, and he rules in the kingdoms of men, and he places over them whomever he pleases. And the moment may come where I have to stand my ground. And I'll be willing to pay the price when that moment comes. In fact, you fast forward to the moment when Daniel is thrown in the lion's den, and there's a new king in town. His name is Darius. He's the king of the Medes and the Persians. Now a second kingdom has taken over Babylon, which means they're more powerful. And even in that kingdom, Daniel, who's been led into exile by God from his homeland, separated from everything that he knows, Daniel in that moment gets to be a display of God's glory to Darius. And listen to what Darius says. Daniel chapter 6, 25 through 28, the letter sent out to the entire kingdom. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he'll endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. What I want to do today is I want to shift your perspective. I want you to see things from God's vantage point, because there's a lesson in the losses that Judah is experiencing, and the lesson is this, that God actually never loses. Don't confuse those things. God is always leading. He is not without a plan in this moment. And he's calling you and I to be a people of faith, not of fear, not of anxiety, not of rage, but a people of faith. And this generation needs to learn that lesson, because we need to be raising up Daniels, Michelle's, Azariah's, Hananiah's. We need to be raising up a generation that believes God is at work. He never loses. He's always leading, and he's calling me to live in faith, not fear, in this moment.
Thank you for listening. For more of our podcasts and to discover how you can connect, visit us at churchak.org or download our Church on the Rock AK app from either iTunes or Google Play.